By common consent, William Collins is reckoned among those writers who prepared the way for the full Romantic revival. And yet it requires some care to reach a precise estimate of his work and to calculate its trend. In the middle decades of the 18th century, 1,000 roads led men from Neoclassical temple of taste and wit, and we find Collins, like many others, making his way along these various paths. The denial of 18th century complacency discovered in the conclusion of the Passions comes out most clearly in Collins' frequent and peculiar use of the progress formula of his time. 4 of his odes conform to the usual pattern of the progress piece. Collins' Ode to Liberty is, in outline and in the first half only, almost the same as Thomson's Liberty, a progress from Greece through Rome, Florence, Venice, Switzerland, and Holland to Britain. But before we dive into the intricacies of this ode, let us first look at what a progress poem is, and what exactly is an ode. In 1734, James Thomson published Liberty, a progress poem. Progress poems were a popular form of Augustan poetry, that is early to mid-18th century, which aimed to trace the advancement of human knowledge, society, science, or literature. These poems were reflective, philosophical, and usually written in formal poetic structure, especially heroic couplets. They were closely tied to Enlightenment ideals, like belief in reason, order, civilization, and human perfectibility. The poet would often compare the present with the past, showing how humanity has improved in art, morality, or intellect. Like many progress poems of the Augustan age, it blends historical narratives, like the rise and fall of classical empires, political idealism, like liberty being the foundational principle, and moral instruction, meaning that nations thrive or fall based on their relationship to liberty. Let us now look at what exactly an ode is. An ode is a lyric poem, often formal and elevated in tone, praising or addressing a person, object, or idea. It is usually longer than other lyric forms. It can be Pindaric, that is structured, Horatian, that is calm and reflective, or irregular. It developed in ancient Greece. It was first developed by Pindar in the 6th and 5th century BC. Pindaric odes were public and choral, and they were used for celebrations. Then, in 1st century BC, Latin odes were developed by Horace, which were more personal and reflective in nature. The English odes emerged in the 17th century via neoclassical poets, but their major revival was seen in 18th century through William Collins and Thomas Gray. They peaked in Romantic period under Keats, Shelley, and Wordsworth. Liberty, James Thomson's nearly 3,500-line blank verse that recounts the Whiggish progress of European civilization and the triumph of British freedom, has been almost unanimously viewed as one of his greatest aesthetic failures, a poem that Johnson once tried to read and soon desisted. To this day, interest in the poem remains mostly historical, perhaps unjustly. For not only did Thomson incorporate sections of his panoramic didactic poem into his later expanded versions of the Seasons, but mid-18th century British poets also acknowledged this most extensive of progress pieces as a central work of patriotic poetry. Collins was educated at Winchester College and later at Magdalen College, Oxford, where he began to develop his poetic voice. While at Oxford, he published his first collection, Persian Eclogues, in 1742, a work that showed his fascination with exotic themes and stylized emotion. Around the late 1740s, William Collins met James Thomson, the author of The Seasons. Collins admired Thomson's natural imagery and emotional depth, which likely influenced his own movement away from rigid Augustan forms toward more visionary and emotional modes of expression. Thomson's blend of poetic grandeur with personal reflection can be seen echoed in Collins' works, particularly in poems like Ode to Evening and Ode on the Poetical Character. However, 1746 was a terrible and bloody year in Scotland. Collins' poetry shows that he felt connected to what happened there because his Scottish friendships, particularly with James Thomson, as well as his uncle Martin's participation in the battles the English fought there. In the early months of the year, Collins' social and literary activities in London continued to gain momentum. His friendship with Samuel Johnson began at this time. For an eager poet seeking friends and literary notice, there was much to do and write, and important family and financial affairs also required him to travel to the continent. In December 1746, 12 years after the first book of Liberty was published, William Collins offered his 144-line Pindaric Ode to Liberty, one of the most ambitious pieces in his collection, odes on several descriptive and allegoric subjects. Although it is indebted at various points to Pope, Dryden, Spenser, the lyrical Milton, and writers of the classical and native British Pindaric traditions, Collins' odes borrows and transforms a substantial part of liberty as its most important recent influence, especially as a model. Collins' ode borrows and transforms substantial parts of liberty. It was its most recent influence, especially as a model of patriotic poetry whose progressive Whig ideology is no longer tenable. The Ode to Liberty redirects pivotal themes, settings, and language in Thomson, resulting in a progress poem that fully responds to a new crisis in international politics and redefines the poet's role as spokesman for the English national conscience. The progress piece assumed various forms, but as developed by Thomson and Collins, among others, it featured an imaginary westward and northward journey of an allegorical entity such as liberty, though both poets also incorporate an important alternative tradition of northern liberty that progresses southwards. A typical progress of power or knowledge traces birth and historical manifestations of his subject from classical times to the present, conveniently ending in contemporary Britain, the last and therefore best model of civilization and government. Yet, despite the connotations of cultural advancement that progress poems suggest, besides their primary meaning to travel, mid-18th century poets are aware of at least two problems related to this scheme of world history. One is that England, like Greece, Rome, the medieval Italian city-states, and most of northern Europe, will enjoy the fruits of liberty for only a limited time in history. Therefore, the spirit migrates further westward, as far away as America. For this, I will be taking a few lines from Bishop Berkeley's poems. There shall be sung another golden age, the rise of empire and of arts, not such as Europe breeds in her decay, such as she bred when fresh and young, when heavenly flame did animate her clay, by future poets shall be sung. Berkeley's poems suggest one further problem of cultural progress and refinement, a certain loss of native, foundational energy, whether this is the visionary power of the first Druid poet-priest, or the vigorously participatory government of an idealized Gothic state. Collins recognizes the limitations and even contradictions in the way that a partisan writer like Thomson approaches these problems and accommodates the progress piece to a different set of contemporary political crises. Whereas the corruption, luxury, and self-interest exemplified by Walpole is the main enemy of liberty for Thomson, Collins more typically places responsibility on the entire nation, which needs to be purged of such ills as the Pretenders' 1745 uprising and British involvement in the unpopular, unsuccessful War of Austrian Succession. Now let us look at some comparisons between Thomson's idea of liberty and Collins' idea of liberty in their pieces Liberty and Ode to Liberty respectively. Let us start by first looking at some similarities between the two poems. The allusions to an idealized Druid past that gave birth to British Temple of Liberty, the embodiment of liberty in models of classical sculpture and architecture, the contemplation of broken, damaged, or violated cultural artifacts as a sign that Southern European nations no longer enjoy freedom, and most importantly, the recurrent cycle of liberty rising and falling in each nation it visits through history, from Greece and Rome onward to England. These are the similarities in the two poems. In both the poems, the intermediate stops include medieval Florence, Genoa, Venice, and Switzerland. Although these points of similarity show a strong affinity between the two poems, these poetic fictions do not suggest a wish for a true return to idealized prelapsarian Druid England, and thus an evasion of historical responsibility, but serve rather as a metaphor for an imperfect world of hope, anticipation of new liberty, freedom, and peace. Although their goals for the progress of British liberty are compatible, the means of attaining this, the responses to contemporary history, and the moral stances in the two poems differ dramatically. Thomson's course of history includes commercial aesthetics and the government prototypes of British liberty, a panoramic view that depends on a highly codified scheme of events in which Greece and Rome serve as the cultural ancestors of England. Collins's view of history does not at all recount events in the manner of a factual chronicle, but resists strict reference to the outside world and instead generates its historical scheme through the formal structure of the poem, with repetitions, symmetries, and brief fables that require the reader to make tentative connections among parts. For example, the Romans are both that Britain has already had and lost its golden age, and that Rome has fallen because of uncontrollable outside forces is ironic, because those nations to which liberty eventually succeeds in traditional progress pieces fall because of outside forces and not internal political corruption, as Thomson more characteristically claims. Thomson grants great material wealth to spiritual forms of virtue, angel, archangel, tutelary gods, whose wisdom and beauty the intensity of divine light conceals. True to the poem's unremitting Whig ideology, a secular, commercial, and cultural heaven also justifies the menial labor of those who cheerfully toil out their appointed years, as if this ideal is this common man's spiritual reward. Collins also draws a supernal model of liberty, but enlarges upon its function in his ode. Rather than making the temple of liberty the final goal of all progressive teleologies, he mediates upon this emblem about the problematic conditions of national freedom. Collins describes its embodiment in a mythic England, for which he wishes to recover the spirit of the lost-destroyed temples, reminders of a supernatural past when spiritual figures roamed the earth. Various elements from other parts of Thomson's poem have also infiltrated this passage. The temple is an architectural mixture of Gothic and Grecian forms, or traditions of northern and Mediterranean liberty. The Druids are also the spiritual ancestors of current British independence. To his favor, and in contrast to Thomson, Collins does not see liberty as a pure ideal, and does not subscribe to a politically partisan ethics that blames the loss of liberty on the corruption of leaders and influential citizens. There is no Walpole in this poem whom Collins can scapegoat as the most serious threat to freedom. The psychological complexity of Collins' ode can only locate violence and freedom on two sides of the same coin, a relationship illustrated by the heroic youths who must murder tyrants in order to liberate Athens. At once, the breath of fear and virtue shedding. Liberty cannot exist without violence towards some oppressor. But when it does thrive, violence from a potential threat is always imminent. The seeds of destruction are almost inevitably sown into liberty, as in medieval Florence before the Medicis dominated and quenched her flame, when they become patrons of art without allowing republican democracy. The repetitions of archetypical transgression within the ode, for example, the desecration of temples or sacred statues, the murder of tyrants during the festival of Athena, only make the situation of liberty more psychologically complicated, without being any less relevant to the immediate history than in Thomson. So this was Collins' most popular progress poem. Some other examples of progress poems are The Progress of Poesy by Thomas Gray, The Triumph of Dullness by Alexander Pope, which is the final section of the Dunciad, and The Progress of Learning by Jonathan Swift. Collins' ambition to be recognized and respected as a writer is made visible by his actions following the publication of his odes on several descriptive and allegorical subjects in December 1746, that marked his true literary breakthrough, his most famous piece being Ode to Evening. Although the collection did not gain much attention at the time and sold poorly, it would later be regarded as one of the most important contributions to English lyrical poetry in the transitional period between Neoclassicism and Romanticism. Dr. Johnson's downright words in which he debits all Collins' works to extravagant romanticism, with the emphasis on imagination rather than sensibility, have been repeated by many. But we must turn back to Dr. Johnson for the key to Collins' temperament and work. He had employed his mind chiefly upon works of fiction and subjects of fancy, and by indulging some peculiar habits of thought, was eminently delighted with those flights of imagination which pass the bounds of nature, and to which the mind is reconciled only by a passive acquiescence in popular traditions. He loved fairies, genii, giants, and monsters. He delighted to rove through the meanders of enchantment, to gaze on the magnificence of golden palaces, to repose by the waterfalls of Elysian gardens. This was, however, the character rather of his inclination rather than his genius. The grandeur of wildness and the novelty of extravagance were always desired by him, but were not always attained. This is what the 18th century said about Collins' ungovernable imagination. It may be hard to recognize in the fantastic Gothic poet of Johnson's description the Collins whom we know, but the central truth about him is reached in this criticism, for his inclinations did indeed outreach his genius, and he aspired to a grandeur and extravagance which he achieved not more than once or twice. Although Collins uses the idea of the lost glories of Greek poetry and music in a romantic way, it must be remembered that the conception itself was a commonplace of his time. It was no new thing to represent the lyric muse with the Grecian form and Grecian robe. Joseph Warton implores fancy to inspire some rural bards with lays that stir the heart, and finally, to bid Britannia rival Greece. Mark Akenside, with what Hartley Coleridge called his classical quixotism, said that his purpose in the pleasures of the imagination was to tune to Attic themes the British lyre, and in the Ode on lyric poetry, sought inspiration for the modern English lyric from the Greek. Moreover, this praise of Greece was closely connected with the praise of freedom, just as in Collins' simplicity and liberty. So this was all about the progress poetry and William Collins as a writer under progress poetry in the 18th century. If you'd like to know more about the 18th century writers and writing styles, have a look at these lectures.